The views expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect those of this station.
Welcome to Insights into Northeast Michigan, a WBKB News public affairs program. Insights deals with the issues affecting those in the community, as well as Northeast Michigan and the state. And now, Insights into Northeast Michigan.
Good morning and welcome to this edition of Insights. I'm joined by ACC Professor of Political Science, Tim Kuhnlein. And Tim, today we're going to talk about probably the most well-known, terrorist organization in the world right now, and that's ISIS. So let's talk a little bit about the background of that organization.
Right. Well, ISIS or ISIL, often referred to as Islamic State as well, and Daesh, these are all names synonymous with this organization that we seem to be obsessed with now, and understandably so, given the fact that it controls a large terrain. It has solidified itself in a very material rather than ethereal way. But what this stands for is the Islamic State of Syria and Iraq, or Iraq and Syria. Often Syria is substituted for the word Levant, which means Greater Syria. It goes back to historical contexts. It's often used, ISIL is often used by our foreign policy experts as a sort of a negative connotation to ISIS, or the Islamic State as they prefer to be called, because it conjures that imperial past, particularly the French presence, and what they represented for what was meant by Syria. So we're talking here about a theocracy, what is essentially a self-declared caliphate that promises to be the sole authority over all of the Islamic world. And this is a problem because it's a Sunni-driven Muslim movement. And I think if nothing else, what we need to understand about the situation in the Middle East is that so much of the problem, aside from the Arab-Israeli conflict in Israel, is the division within Islam itself. It's almost like they're going through what the Christian world went through centuries ago in the Protestant Reformation, which we're celebrating the 500th anniversary of this year, so we're commemorating, if you will.
And so going back to the background, I mean, ISIS wasn't something people really talked about until a few years ago, where it really kind of became the topic of conversation, at least regarding terrorism around the world. So right. Kind of where did that come from? Well,
it's a transnational terrorist organization, which is different from our more traditional terrorist organizations, which are international, meaning that or international. But transnational suggests that these organizations don't regard national boundaries. Their allegiances cross over these, and their following is devoid of any modern notion of national identity. They want to recreate a whole new construct, and you have to understand they're developing in areas that where political boundaries were imposed by European colonial powers centuries ago. Or at least particularly in the last century, going back to World War I, with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the Persian Empire and the confluences there. So yeah, but ISIS itself comes about in the late 90s, but really manifests itself with the occupation of Iraq in 2003, because basically what ISIS is the Sunni movement of the Ba'athist regime, which was Saddam Hussein's party. And when they lost control of Iraq by virtue of US occupation, these people were often imprisoned and rallied, their military personnel, intelligence personnel, they rallied against the now Shia-dominant government of Iraq. And well, there's a sordid story about how they organized within the prisons under US occupation during the Bush administration. We didn't really understand the dynamic. And as the Syrian civil war unfolds and they are released from these prisons for various reasons, this movement of ISIS, or the Islamic State, slowly but surely evolves.
And I want to touch on a point you brought up earlier. It was kind of how they're a transnational organization. So just give me a little more background on that. Most terrorist organizations kind of station in one country and operate there, but this one's kind of spread.
Right. For example, Hamas is primarily isolated within a specific country, whereas ISIS is not really about one national movement. It's a pan-Arab movement, and it's particularly Sunni-based. Sunnis are the majority of Muslims. Kind of a comparison would be Catholics and Protestants, if you will. And they're in a bloody war with one another like Protestants and Catholics were 500 years ago. It's very convoluted, of course. And I think my primary concern with this is that we seem to be fixated on one movement as we have iteration after iteration. You know, it was Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda and ISIS are not of the same ilk. And there are so many. I mean, there are 44 international or transnational terrorist organizations. And then there are so many others that are not transnational, but more national terrorist organizations, domestic in nature. In the Middle East and elsewhere, this doesn't all have to do with radical fundamentalism in the Muslim world. But we are fixated on this. And I think it's...
Why do you think that is? Because there's, you know, tens of terrorist organizations, like you said.
Well, I think the primary explanation is that they have probably the greatest grab on land. So this sort of ethereal, esoteric movement, intellectual movement, whatever you want to call it, ideological movement, whatever you want to call it, grounded in a premise of religion, although it's hijacking a religion in many respects. It's managed to get hold of land and resources and control that, and it's crossed boundaries. So, and then when you mix that into the fold of what happened in Iraq with the Shia rise to power, the US backing of that, and what happened in Syria, which is basically Shia, at least the government, it's Alawite, but they're closer to the Shia movement. You've got a dynamic here that plays out with the relationships of Syria to Iran, which is also Shia Muslim. And Iran, although Persian, not Arab, being Shia Muslim, has sort of an alliance with the Shia movement of Iraqis. And Sunni ISIS is in the middle, but it's gaining ground. And we are fixated on the ISIS situation, but the larger problem really is the other organizations in response, because they're really in many respects no less threatening. I mean, obviously we've got a concern about Iran and what that represents. So I guess what I'm getting at is this tends to be the latest obsession. I don't want to understate the importance of following it and paying attention, but I think too often we, in good old American fashion, get fixated on a tree and kind of miss the forest. And it'd behoove us to start backing away from those individual trees and start seeing the bigger picture here.
Definitely an interesting topic, Tim. We're going to continue this conversation right after the break, so stay tuned because there's more insights coming up.